So this is work that Amable has led with colleagues at University of Rwanda, Fidel, and also Dave Weatherspoon has been quite involved in this work as well. Basically, the premise or the motivation of this work was the fact that Rwanda had this very major policy reform back in the late 2000s related to inputs use and land consolidation and basically reforming their agriculture sector. And we were interested in understanding, well, what the impacts of these have been over time, using some of the same data sets that Chuck was just referring to, the EICB data. And again, the big thrust of this work was understanding the impact of that policy change. And so the program that we're looking into is called the Crop Intensification Program. Basically, it's a land consolidation program where you take smaller plots of land, combine them into bigger ones, and give the farmers a lot of inputs to be more productive. So so there's a lot of investments from the government on these facilitating access to inputs and resources. So our interest here was looking at prices of commodities over time and comparing that across regions where the crop intensification program was more than other regions where it wasn't as much. And then I'll show you a map of the regions where we characterize certain areas where we find that the CIP program was much more involved in those areas, whereas in other areas it wasn't. So again, we're doing this sort of difference in different type of work, basically understanding whether the prices of food commodities in those areas was different or not. So we have, so we're looking at prices for beans, and we're looking at prices of maize, so maize production and bean production. So this is the graph of the changes before and after the implementation of the land policy, and how those bean prices are different across the two regions, the intensive CIP region and the non-intensive CIP region. And what we find is that in this case, for the case of beans, the non-intensive CIP region, it's higher than the intensive CIP region. So there's something going on in terms of the fact that there was this program and it had an impact on prices. And similarly for maize, where we do have in the intensive region, we find prices to be lower, but those prices were lower to begin with. So the issue becomes whether the CIP had an influence or not. So just to sort of, again, I'm just giving you the gist of of our work. And what we're finding is that the two prices are indeed co-integrated with the non-CIP prices. And there is a slight divergence across the two regions. That the analysis suggests that there are these price gaps between the two. And so that was the basic objective of our work, to understand the difference in prices, because obviously the changes in prices will have impacts on how much consumption happens, how much the impacts on nutrition. You know, I'm sure if Amadli was here, he would talk a little more about the nutritional implications of that. So I'm sorry I had to rush through that, but you know, apologize for the fact that Amadli wasn't here. So.
Well, no, thanks very much for stepping in, Anwar, and you know, giving us a sense of what this case study was about. Now, just in this we're out of time here, but I just need one question of clarification, is that the assumption here is that the project increased productivity, which could have contributed to lower prices. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And then the second assumption is that there's enough that you could see this in prices because of kind of internal trade barriers, cost of transportation, and so forth. So you would expect regional prices to differ.
That would be what, and then also sort of specialization and just the fact that they're producing more. So there's a supply shock in some sense.
Yeah, but if the markets are integrated, I mean, those would be, you know, you can trade it across regions if you don't have internal trade barriers, and so you might not see those a supply shock in one region might not affect prices in that region any more than any other region.
Right. So yes. So there, I guess yeah. So there might be some effect of the efficiency of transportation or trading isn't that great. That's why you're seeing some sort of supply shock. I guess that's one way to interpret it.
Okay, well, interesting work, and our session we've run out of time, and so I'm going to draw it to a conclusion. But I'd like to give my sincere thanks to all the presenters, and turn it back to the conference organizer. I guess that's Carl. Back to you.
Well, yep. I'll just say thanks also.
Thank you.
To Keith and to the group for these presentations, and to Anwar for being our backstopper on two presentations. And so we now have a 15-minute break until 10:45, and then we'll start with a new the next session. Let's see. Anything else that we need to say? Mackenzie or Lata or anybody?
No call. Thank you. Thank you, Keith. Thank you all.
I'm good on my end. Yeah, so we'll pause the recording for the next 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Have coffee.
So who knows?
He knows how to hook us up. I mean, how to hook himself up. He's been on the call a little bit earlier, so I'm sure he'll be here. But
Okay.
if you want to go ahead with somebody else, well, that's fine.
Okay. So I should just go ahead and get started?
Guess we could give it a minute or two and see if he shows up. But
Okay. Yeah, I'll do it at, I'll start right at 10:45, max 10:46 on my
Okay.
my clock.
I'll send him another reminder. Oops. Okay, well, we're in touch with him. But so why don't we go ahead with
Okay.
speaker, whoever.
Okay, great. All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session in the conference. This 1 hour is going to be spent on 4 presentations on best practices and applications of policy change. I'm Dave Tschirley from Michigan State University, Ag, Food and Resource Economics, and I direct the PRCI, which is the Feed the Future Innovation Lab on Food Security Policy. So I'm here in that capacity, I guess. And so what I think I will do is just hand it over to the next speaker in this list, which is Eric Raile of Montana State University. Eric will be followed by Regina Birner of the University of Hohenheim, then Samuel Ledermann of George Washington University, and then we'll finish up with Tom Reardon. I'll be monitoring Q&A and chat, so please put your questions there. Thanks, Eric. Take it away.
All right. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, okay. So I'm Eric Raile from Montana State University, and I'm going to talk today about implications of political and public will models for encouraging climate-smart agriculture. So this is a project we started several years ago under the auspices of the Rutgers Consortium, and we are just wrapping up now. I want to mention our research partners for this project. We had some collaborators and partners in Senegal. So you see 3 of those there, 2 in Uganda, and a number of research partners in the United States as well. And I'm going to come back to the research partners at the end of the presentation, but I want to make sure that I mention them up front because they're important to the research. The roots of this research start with the research that we had done on political will and public will. So in 2010, we published a piece that defined political will and operationalized or gave ideas about operationalization. And then in 2014 did the same with public will. I'm summarizing here, but political will is meaningful support for a specific course of action. Public will being the same thing on the public side, but recognizing that there can be lots of different publics in any given place. We also have this piece that was just published in Action Research that kind of lays out how you would go through a study that tries to build political will or measure political will and public will. The other strand of this is climate smart agriculture. Many of you are probably familiar with climate smart agriculture and its basic features, and those are sustainably increasing productivity and incomes, adaptation and resilience, and then where possible, reducing and removing greenhouse gas emissions. Our methods were primarily based on semi-structured interviews. So we conducted interviews in Senegal in 2015 and 16, in Uganda in 2015 and 18. Then we deductively and inductively coded those interview transcripts. And for some of the publications and pieces of research that resulted, we used a frequency-based scoring method. We have 3 major research questions tied to this particular project. The first one that we addressed was, how do different stakeholders understand climate and socioeconomic problems related to agriculture in Uganda and Senegal? Understanding those different problem definitions and understandings is really important to building political will and public will. So we started there. And then I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is sort of an illustration of the kind of work we did with the scoring. So on the left-hand side, you have stakeholder views of climate agriculture problems in Uganda. The right-hand side, also in Uganda, socioeconomic and infrastructure agriculture problems. On the left-hand side, these are reasonable kinds of problems, and they tie pretty well to climate smart agriculture. On the right-hand side, what's really notable is the sheer volume of different problems that people mention. We did the same for Senegal. And again, reasonable kinds of problems that fit pretty well with climate smart agriculture. And then on the right-hand side, different views of the most important problems, because we've scaled here based on a formula that we devised, but different views of problems based on the particular stakeholder group. The second research question asked about opportunities for generating political and public will for adopting CSA in Senegal. So this was our deeper dive into Senegal. And on the political will side, we found that there are lots of potential avenues for influence within the government. The emerging Senegal plan, which is important, largely fits with CSA objectives. There are a lot of useful government agriculture programs, and we particularly emphasized the climate smart village approach, and Dr. Sanogo one of our partners, works with the Climate Smart Village and has been instrumental there. On the downside, we did find that the government was emphasizing support for rice and rice self-sufficiency, and that was at times to the detriment of climate smart agriculture initiatives. On the public side, we observed that community radio was often influential. There were competing problems and some coordination issues, but there was local support in the places we visited, and we had evidence of other places for climate smart agriculture kinds of initiatives, as long as they recognized local needs. But we also find evidence that it was possible that people would identify, and communities would identify with CSA programs and sponsors. The third research question asked about the obstacles to building public support for adopting CSA in Uganda. So this was our deeper dive into Uganda. I'm not going to talk about this entire graphic, but the top row is the definitional components of public will. On the bottom, we have the current situation. That ideal configuration is the second row. And then the really important part here is what are the needs? So what needs to happen to get from that current situation to the ideal configuration? So I come back to that in a little bit. But I want to spend more time on these opportunities for outscaling or upscaling climate smart agriculture. In Senegal, there are opportunities for policy entrepreneurs who could join problems and solutions as long as they're effective messengers. There are opportunities for agribusiness entrepreneurs in terms of information dissemination and demonstration plots, but also in terms of equipment, inputs, financing. So lots of different opportunities. And then for governments and donors, opportunities to support research and communication efforts, to provide enabling environments for these other efforts, and then also to subsidize some of these efforts. For Uganda, and this is coming from that figure I just showed you, it's a little bit different approach, but there are opportunities in terms of communication, so building the extension service and communication infrastructure. Producer associations pose real opportunities. There are similarly opportunities for basic and agricultural infrastructure, from transportation to electricity, input, storage, marketing, lots of different opportunities. Also some opportunities to work with incentives in terms of plot sizes and non-farm income. But we see opportunities for industry, for government, and for donors, whether separately or together. I'd like to talk about some of the other project outcomes and influences here. Dr. Sanogo, who's working with the Climate Smart Village approach, has continued work there, has published with a number of other people, and has gained some international recognition for this work. On the policy side, we've generated, and you've seen some of these, a lot of bottom-up ideas, also a lot of public-private kinds of ideas that might be implemented. Some of those need government approval and some of them do not. So there are different avenues here, potentially. The 4 research articles we had that came out of the project are being cited. Some of them are relatively recent, but they're starting to be cited and they're getting traction. Our African partners in Senegal and Uganda have also seen career advancement based on the work that we did, which we think is important. And then so this is basically a pared down version of a brown bag I did for USAID in March of this year that discussed this research. And that was a brown bag that was really well attended. Lots of folks from USAID in the audience and outside USAID, both in the US and in Africa, lots of different places. So hopefully the dissemination of the research has gone well and we can have some impact that way as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Okay, right on time. I think we'll hold questions until the end. I don't see anything in the Q&A box yet, but please use that as questions come into your mind. I'll be monitoring it. Regina Birner from University of Hohenheim, fostering political will to drive sustainable ag transformation. Regina.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to continue right on this topic and drill a bit deeper into this issue of political will with regard to agricultural transformation. And this is joint work with Anwar here, Carl Bray and Jock Anderson. And we published that also in the Africa Agricultural Status Report, Chapter 2 of 2018. So what is actually political will? And Laurie Post found this great quote: the sine qua non of policy success, which is never defined except by its absence. And so if something is not happening, we always talk about the lack of political will. But of course, there have been many efforts to define it over time. We have just heard from Eric about some here, some others. So by Brinkerhoff, the commitment of actors to undertake actions to achieve a set of objectives, and then very important to sustain the costs of those actions over time. We have heard already about this subsidy programs in the previous sessions, where we don't know whether productivity gains will actually be maintained after they end, as an example. In this piece, we actually looked at what could be possible indicators of political will to drive agricultural transformation. And one that's quite often used is government spending on food and agriculture. It could be the composition of government spending. For example, does the money go to subsidies or to investments in research and extension? The regulatory environment for agriculture and agribusiness. I think in the previous session, Lata's presentation on seed sector reforms would be an example. If you reform the seed sector, that could be an indication of political will. To what extent a government relies on donor funding rather than its own resources could be seen as an indicator of political will. And then very important, in line with Brinkerhoff's model, is continuity of effort. So monitoring indicators over time. And if we start with that one, we could say that CADAP, you may remember Usman Badian's presentation yesterday, is actually doing a very good job in continuity of effort by monitoring indicators over time. You may all know the RASAC's website, which I think is a great compendium that shows the indicators, but it also measures progress towards commitments that the CADAP countries have actually set for themselves. But if you look then at the different indicators, we find that some do not look so good. So CADAP itself has long ago set a goal of 10% government expenditure for agriculture as percent of total expenditure. And we see, well, none of the regions in sub-Saharan Africa is actually, or Northern Africa, is actually meeting this goal. One could measure it different. The FAO publishes it as the Agricultural Orientation Index. So we measure expenditure as a percentage of agriculture value added. Then some regions look somewhat better, Northern and Southern Africa, but the others still don't show any increase. But what this is actually masking, this average figures, is that we have large variations across countries. And if we just look at this government expenditure again, we find that some countries like Malawi and Ethiopia do actually very well, and others don't do much at all. So the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan are actually the lower end. And it has been an interesting discussion, and there's of course a lot of political science literature on the question, how do we actually explain, for example, why is Ethiopia and Malawi doing better on that indicator than others? And but there's an emerging literature also in economics on the role of individual leadership in the political science literature that has long been acknowledged. But if you look at Ethiopia, for example, we may just look at an interesting anecdote. Yeah? So Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, who was a very strong promoter of putting agriculture on the agenda, yeah, there is this anecdote that when he was a guerrilla leader, he had a separate associated horse that was carrying books. And among these books was John Mellor's Agriculture on the Road to Industrialization. And also this guerrilla experience made him know the rural countryside. And maybe this personal experience may have promoted his strong support to agriculture. And we also know from the Indian Green Revolution, for example, that individual figures such as M.S. Swaminathan or Subramaniam, who was the Minister of Agriculture at the time, can actually play quite an essential role. So that is something we should not be overlooked. If we look at differences between countries, then we can also look at other indicators. Thanks to the MAFAB team at the FAO, we have a lot of data here, nominal rate of protection at farm gate. And here we also see huge differences across countries. And if we look at Ethiopia from that indicator, it doesn't look that good because it has rather, through the overall set of policies, a rather strong disincentives to the agricultural sector, whereas others like Senegal look much better. And research actually can look into the question, what is the role, for example, of farmers' organizations? How does it translate into parliamentary decision? And then what is the role of regional organizations such as AGRA here that has been promoting these goals? We can look at this reliance and donor funding, and not surprisingly, we actually find that the national budgets on the average, this is 13 African countries from 2004 to 2018, prefer to spend their own resources on producer transfers, so that is subsidies, and relied more on donor funding for investment in infrastructure, research, and extension, which one could perhaps interpret as a lack of political will to support that. But it is also, as our own research has shown in countries such as Uganda, Senegal, and others, an issue of policy beliefs. Yeah, so lack of political will to transform agricultural food systems is typically not due to any lack of awareness or understanding. It is rather resulting from power struggles between different groups of actors. One can use the advocacy coalition framework to study that, and they have not only competing economic interests, so this is what economists usually focus on, but also competing value and belief systems, and they have quite different policy beliefs. Yeah, and what is actually the role and the relevance of a particular instrument? And through discourse analysis of wide range of stakeholders in several African countries, we found that policy beliefs differ often quite considerably between domestic policymakers and donor agencies when it comes to issues such as input subsidies. So maybe one final conceptual thought on how can political will to transform the agri-food system actually be strengthened. Of course, we have to look at all the different actors in the agri-food system, the farmers, the input suppliers, the processing industries, the citizens and the consumers, and so on. That has an international dimension. And ultimately, we are interested in the various outcomes. But this can be influenced by policy instruments that influence what we could say the production side. Yeah, so farmers, so input subsidies, for example, would be here, any kind of regulation, seed sector reforms, and what we have seen are actually on this side, but also policy instruments that look at the consumer side, food safety programs, for example, would be here. But how is the government actually incentivized to use or not to use these instruments? That is in itself an outcome of the influence of farmers and agribusiness associations, political parties, civil society organizations, and the media. And of course, there's also a role of research and education that can provide data. Also in the previous session, Saveda has shown very interesting examples on how data collection can actually also influence policy. And here in this blue arrows, we have the different entry points. In Feed the Future has actually used quite a number of those. So one important entry point is setting common goals. So also from Usman's presentation, we have seen how important it is that CAADP sets this goal, monitors the goals. SDGs, I think, is also an important strategy. Then support to government, government reforms and funding is an important entry point. This research collaboration I just mentioned, an example, training young scholars, particularly important strategy. Then something that may often be overlooked on influencing the public discourse. So for example, training journalists on issues of agricultural transformation. Now, that's not typically only an issue of developing country. Just here in Germany, I recently participated in a seminar to train science journalists on new developments in the agricultural sector. So that can be actually an important strategy just to provide knowledge to them. And then, of course, and also something that Feed the Future has done, strengthening non-state actors, in particular farmers organizations and other civil society organizations, so that they actually can have a stronger voice here. If you come to some key messages, so obviously political will is important to drive agricultural transformation because there is a strong role for the government, even if it's a private sector activity we are talking here. We have seen that political will can be measured according to different indicators, and they do not always go into the same direction. If we look at these indicators, we can see that the political will to drive agricultural transformation has remained somewhat limited. And I think we have also seen that in earlier presentations that have tried to do such analysis. But what we really need to emphasize that there are large differences across countries, and average regional values don't really tell us very much. Policy beliefs, I think we should recognize, play an important role in explaining the choice of policy instruments, and they may differ between different groups of actors. There is evidence that high-level political leaders can also play a decisive role in agricultural transformation. So leadership training of young professionals, for example, can play a role. And there's a wide range of strategies that can be fostered, can be used to foster political will, and development partners obviously can play an important role, but domestic actors and farmers organizations are ultimately critical. Okay, let me stop here, and I look forward to the discussion and any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you, Regina. Samuel Ledermann, George Washington University, Ag Innovation Systems, Ag Extension, Digital Agriculture, and Inequality. Samuel.
All right, I'll mute myself. What a title, huh? So I'm not starting with the title slide, but rather with what we actually looked at, which is looking at what is the impact of COVID-19 on ag innovation systems, which has the work been led by Carl and Jock, and on ag extension and digital advisory services, which I have led and Jock has published quite a bit on. The starting point, sort of using this black box, and I think what I'm presenting is quite complementary to what Eric and Regina, fantastic presentation, just presented on, is sort of thinking about these bigger trends, you know, that came out of COVID. So people have talked very early on, such as McKinsey, about how COVID is causing the great acceleration, sort of between those at the top and the bottom of the power curve. Perry et al., I thought that article was very neatly done, looking at how COVID-19 is exacerbating inequalities in the American heartland. And that aspect of inequality then has also been picked up by the United Nations or by policy actors or advocacy groups such as Oxfam, who have termed the pandemic the inequality virus. And so using that as an entry point, my goal today, together with Jock, who's in the audience and might join us for the Q&A, 4 points for today to talk about a bit these trends and inequalities within the state of ag innovation systems, within the state of ag extension, take a closer look at Uganda, where I know Regina has worked a lot on as well, and you know, then look at the opportunities and policy options available. So at the state of ag innovation system, as I said, this was led by Carl and Jock together with Latha and myself. Sort of the pre-COVID trends were that ag R&D funding was stagnant or declining, with the exception of China, India, and Brazil. Positive trend was at the level of the genomics or big data and gene editing that were accelerating. Artificial intelligence, drones, and sensors, which are relevant for digital agriculture, were also on the rise. When we think about the impact of the pandemic on funding, and this comes out of a lot of interviews that Carl did with key stakeholders, at the funding level, actually, the national systems that were doing poorly pre-COVID, they are having, it's even worse now. So the example is South Africa and Brazil that had budget cuts or reduced spending. And the private sector picture is mixed now. I think the latest you know, stock reports will show a bit of a different picture, but haven't been incorporated yet. But overall, OECD spending was lower on R&D, but there were increases in India and China. At the level of research and innovation, the travel restriction clearly caused an immediate moderate decline. And you know, the trends overall pre-pandemic were accelerated. Some notable interesting points that emerged from that research was, for example, around funding for biological research. I put the example here of the International Livestock Research Institute and their research on mRNA for African swine fever, and you know, sort of the importance or rise of CRISPR in that context as well. So moving on to, I think, Jock, when you presented yesterday, you said part of what you presented on, you finished the day before. This is similar, this is quite fresh, but I've had the pleasure of working together with Jock and Carl on trying to get a better understanding of what the trends are around the state of ag extension, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, which is my regional expertise. I worked in development in Eastern and Southern Africa. We also developed a conceptual framework of the impact from digital extension and COVID-19, but it's not nearly as neat as Regina's. So I'll spare you, you know, walking you through this in 10 minutes or in my 10 minutes. but I'll share the link to my presentation so you can also peruse it. We tried to map here what the positive or negative effects would be from COVID-19 and from ICT. Overarchingly, and I think this is just repeating Regina's larger point, that there is a decline in ag spending. Now, this is across all sub-Saharan Africa, with obviously these country variations. There's overall a negative trend in public extension, although the data there is very crude. The larger point maybe to emphasize is that actually the digital divide still looms large. So this is annual data. So while affordability and connectivity have been on the increasing, the gender gap in ownership and literacy actually have not changed much, or possibly are, they're meandering up and down. And so in summary, sort of what we found just with that crude analysis is where COVID-19 looms large, digital advisory services are actually missing. And that puts a bit of a context, or in context, that hope, right, that just pushing everything to the digital realm will be a solution. And, so these are based upon data. For example, I'll just focus here on the left. The map on the left is characterizing the countries along the risk of impact from COVID-19. So you see, for example, right, the countries that would have the highest risk are also the ones that have only one digital advisory services. There's this large cluster of advisory services in East Africa, right? Kenya is the dominant hub for it, as well as English-speaking Ghana and Nigeria. So, alternatively, in West Africa, where extension services might be on the decline, that's also where fewer of these advisory services actually exist. Linking this trend to the inequalities that I mentioned earlier, I think what we overall see is that there are three rural inequalities that are accelerated by COVID-19. So one is at the level of economic inequality, that Matthews effect, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. At the level of gender inequality, I think it's well understood about the negative impact on nutrition at the household level or intra-household level on women, gender-based violence, for example, as well as informal job losses. I'm a geographer by training, so I care about space. And when you think about spatial inequality, actually, the social distancing obviously accentuated that digital divide, because the poorest households are the ones who rely on peer-to-peer learning, and might not have access to actually using, these digital tools that are available in the marketplace to overcome these challenges. So taking a closer look to sort of grounded in Uganda, these are preliminary findings using the LSMS database from 2005 to the latest 2019 wave. Extension visits decline each year. Largely, the data seems to confirm our literature findings that income and gender inequality matter when it comes to extension access. So female-headed households and those with less land owned are also less likely to receive advice. Now, rounding this up around opportunities and policy options that emerge. So I tried to combine all of the work that we have done here at the level of the ag innovation systems and ag extension. So one thing is key, that obviously the essential worker status for scientists, technicians, and extension was really important. An opportunity emerges around, there's increased collaboration with other scientists because they were sharing the labs for COVID research. And so that is an opportunity. In terms of policy options, from my point of view, and I teach in development practice here at George Washington University. So the first point is obviously to support capacity building. So actually extension officers can take advantage of digital tools if they exist. But rather the second point looms large in just about every development effort, and I think it's relevant here. But actually, as we are sort of building the trend of using digital advisory services is increasing overall, I believe we should also step up monitoring efforts to actually understand the impact, especially when we think about the more marginalized communities that might not be able to take as easily advantage of it. When we think about mid to long term, there's a first point is around investing in IT infrastructure, and Regina pointed out very well like how that investment could take place, what's needed, including for strong national and international research centers. Once Tom is here, he might correct me, but I picked up, I thought he said it's the blood and bones, the infrastructure, and so I think that investment would pay off significantly, especially as we might think about like fancy videos, for farmers to access, but in reality, if you have only a 2G network or a 3G network, that's not even feasible. In regard to the strong national and international research centers, this is where that feedback loop is really important, right? So the opportunities with digital tools, right? It's also that actually the users can provide feedback or possibly generate some bottom-up knowledge, but you obviously need to have the capacity for research centers to take advantage of that. I just want to reiterate here David's input, David Silverman's on the UN Food System Summit, around that discussion that the CGIAR should actually could possibly include extension efforts. Regarding the other points, one is around reducing the barriers to importing innovations, including weak intellectual property rights, or to encourage collaborations with private sector actors. I think, for example, creating a startup ecosystem, and this goes to the point of to get the flame to take off where already something is brewing. In terms of research priorities adjustments at the level of ag innovation system could be at a level of One Health, whereas at ag extension, I think from my point of view, possibly focusing on developing more gender inclusive digital extension services that are agent based. So as opposed to self-service, could pay off quite a bit if you want to reach these more marginalized population. And I picked this up on Jim's slide that Carl presented in regards to the contemporary transformation, right? It's 15 to 24-year-old rural women who are often poor, hungry, and systematically marginalized. And I think those could be reached quite easily. So with all that said, I thank you for having joined this exploration from that black box that we have done, and we look forward to staying engaged. In case you don't get to ask a question, here's also my email and Jock's email, and we look forward to the discussion that's to follow.
Okay, thank you, Samuel, for the big overview of big questions there, big topics you were dealing with. Tom has now joined us. So we have Tom Reardon from Michigan State, Policies to Improve Food Supply Chains in Asia and Africa. Tom.
Unmute. Can you see my screen?
Yes, and we can hear you. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. So today, I think Carl told me I have about an hour. I don't know if I'll need the whole hour. No, just joking. Let's see. Let me change this to swap presenter view. Can you see the full screen now?
Yep, it looks perfect.
Full screen.
Okay. For this policy session, I will focus on, sorry, some sinuses. This policy session, I'll talk about policy lessons that we learned from the work both in Nigeria, and so this is joined with Sawida and with Ben, and also work that is related that we did in Asia and in other parts of Africa, basically looking at what were the government responses to COVID, and in terms of the lockdown policies and the debate, and not just the government debate, but also what was the international debate like during this time, and what would help food supply chains to be more resilient and policies to be better to help that resilience. And I'll go through just a few key points in this few minutes about what we saw the debate focused on, what we saw governments doing, and then compare it to sort of stylized facts or results of the research funded by USAID that contradicted or ended up allowing us to question whether the debate was focused correctly or the policy actions were formulated optimally. And an overwhelming first point is about the focus of the debate during, especially in 2020. when the COVID shock occurred, people, both in the donor community, international community, and the government started to, from my point of view, obsessively focus on what will this do to trade? Will this shut the door to imports? Will this impede our exports? And a lot of that focus really mirrors the pre-COVID debate, where people thought, okay, the action is really in trade. And the domestic supply chains are sleepy, stagnant, traditional. There's a big missing middle. It's a big mess. And basically underemphasizing greatly thinking about domestic supply chains of food in the food security debate. And that focus in the debate is almost exactly the inverse of its importance in reality. And so what we found in our analysis is that domestic supply chains supply 90% of national food consumption, for example, in Africa, but also in Asia, and supply and basically move 95% of food output markets. So 95% of the output that's produced is moved by the domestic supply chains. If you look at Africa overall, imports are only 10% of overall food consumption figured in tons. That varies a little bit by product and by country, et cetera, but the overall average is 10%. In Nigeria, 5%. Okay, so imports almost don't affect the overall food security situation. And then if you look at exports, only 5% of agri-food output is exported from Africa, and it's in Asia. And another underemphasized point, besides the importance of domestic supply chains in food security and consumption, is that if you have a constrained domestic supply chain, it also constrains your intra-regional and extra-regional trade. Usman emphasized the importance of getting intra-regional trade going in Africa, but you need to, that it's necessary to fix and to maximize the domestic supply chains to be able to meet export targets, and also to ensure long-term competitiveness. The second overall policy lesson. So the first policy lesson was don't immediately focus on the world market and whether the ports are open or not. Put that in perspective and realize that 90% of the food is being moved along the highways and byways of the domestic market. Focus on those first for 9/10 of your time, and then look at what's going on with trade. Secondly, what we found the government's doing is focusing on vertical supply chains and not the lateral supply chains. And Sawida brought this up in her talk, and now I'll emphasize it. Basically, when the lockdowns occurred, governments had to declare some goods and some services essential, and then others they declared non-essentials. And the non-essentials were blocked, were stopped, were locked down, and then the essentials were allowed to function, maybe with some strictures as to how they functioned. So for example, Nigeria immediately said, okay, let's keep maize markets going, because maize is the central grain food. And in South Africa, because citrus exports are crucial in the ag sector, they said, let's keep the citrus export channels going, okay, allow the packing plants to work, allow the ports to function, etc. And so they aligned their policies that way. But what they were not doing, and in Nigeria, they didn't have very much of a course correction. In South Africa, they did have a course correction. But the governments were neglecting what we call the lateral supply chains. Lateral supply chains are the blood that's feeding each of the cells of each segment, each stage of the vertical supply chain. Okay, so wholesalers need to have truck services, logistics services. Packing plants need to have materials like crates that they put the fruit into. And all of them need labor. Okay, so each segment needs these feeding, these veins that are feeding all of the you could think of it as a spine, the vertical spine, each of the discs of the spine. So in Nigeria, for example, there was an ignoring of the extreme importance of the third-party logistics, the trucking services. And so these logistics were either declared non-essentials, or there were policies that constrained their movement by making a lot of ambiguities. But it was not taken into account that, for example, urban maize traders that are standing between, let's say, 70% of the maize produced in the country by 8 million farmers and the consumers, only 4% of them own trucks. Only 4% of them own trucks. 75% of the maize that's moved in Nigeria is moved by these third-party logistics, these trucking firms and warehouse firms. And so when you had a fracture, you caused a fracture in that, or a blockage in that blood that was going to the different segments of the maize supply chain by blocking off the logistics, okay? In South Africa, even more interesting, is there was this obsession with let's keep the citrus export supply chain going, but because the wood and the forestry sector is not essential during COVID, let's declare that non-essential. So they declared materials like wood inessential. But then what happened is that fractured the supply chain of wood to crate manufacturer, fruit crate, and then the fruit crates disappeared and they weren't available for the citrus packing plants. So the exports started to fall apart. So the point is, you know, everybody thinks food system, and you know, often they're not taking into account that there's an active, you know, brewing food system. I made this point yesterday as a kind of a critique of the UN Food System Summit assumptions that, you know, these supply chains are broken, there's a missing middle. Actually, they're very dynamic and very complex, and governments not focusing in on that complexity and their codependence on all of these kinds of services then lead them to policies that are misaligned with the needs. And, you know, as Samuel was noting from my obsessive statement in the first day in the UN Food System Summit, I felt like a lot of that was, that summit discussion was really focused on reinventing the wheel, trying to start things that were already started, move things that were already moving. And what we found in this USAID funded research is that the supply chains that are existing, that are really driven by, you know, obviously they're fed by farms, but they're facilitated and driven by the midstream, the wholesalers, the truckers, the processors. That is a very dynamic and extremely rapidly growing and proliferating set of sectors in food supply chains, both in Africa and in Asia. And basically, the wholesalers and the logistics are the blood of the food supply chains. If that doesn't flow, the whole thing dies, okay? And what we found with these policies that I just mentioned is there was an impeding of the flow of the blood, okay? And also, we found that there was an inheritance from before COVID of underinvestment in the bones, okay? The bones of the food system are the wholesale markets, the roads, the ports, and also the soft infrastructure that affect transaction costs. These had been allowed to dilapidate. Sometimes the investments from the 70s had been not renewed and dilapidation had occurred. So you had a falling apart of the wholesale markets, a pitting and potting and destruction of the roads, a falling apart of the ports. Then when you have a shock that hits them, the thing starts to fall apart. So the time to invest, as I'm going to argue, is now. But the impeding by policy of the blood flow and the poor bones that had been inherited from before COVID actually ended up constraining the pivoting, the shifting, the reacting, the adapting that the supply chain actors needed during the time. And not just the physical supply chain actors, but also those that were trying to do this famous leapfrog, which I'll mention in a moment, because you can't leapfrog without this investment. And so that's what I'll focus on last, is that we saw that there was a lot of pivoting that went on, but more in Asia than in Africa. And let's say a type of pivoting that we studied was the shift to delivery, because people didn't want to go to the markets, they didn't want to go to the restaurants. So there was a pivot to e-commerce. And that was really very successful in a number of places in Asia, like India and China, etc. In Africa, far more limited, even though there was, you know, when I deal with multilaterals that are really with glitter and glow in their eyes about how e-commerce will allow Africa to leapfrog and jump over the mire of the problems of supply chains and immediately into a new century. Well, that can't be done. The problem is that goods still need to be moved by roads, need to come through ports, need to fly on airplanes. If you don't have the physical bones and the blood functioning, e-commerce is just a dream, okay? And so and what we found is that where it was working, you found a shift to e-commerce that allowed the resilience in the supply chain to be manifest. This even happened in wholesale markets. In South Africa, for example, with beef auction, in Myanmar with pulses and beans, the wholesale markets even embraced digitalization and e-commerce. And it wasn't just big firms like Amazon or Alibaba that were pivoting and showing this resilience. You also had, for example, in India, massive amount of delivery by the likes of Swiggy that were delivery intermediaries for tens of thousands of small and medium restaurants, okay? And there's many other examples like Uber India, which then retooled and itself pivoted, co-pivoted with the needs of the small shops, the needs of small restaurants. So you had this big wave in Asia of all of these adjustments that were made, shifts toward e-commerce, shifts toward e-wholesale, shifts toward delivery intermediaries that allowed the system to quickly, or more or less quickly, heal from the shock of the COVID. But that pivoting, that innovation was really based on prior investments in the blood and the bones. Okay, where that investment had not been made, then you found that it was very difficult for the system to be resilient. And the prior investment that was made in innovation, for example, in e-commerce itself, in delivery intermediaries, that was before COVID, so that it was inherited into COVID and set free, set to manifest itself, set to help save the situation by having the proper fundamentals in place of the blood and the bones. So crucial was both the investment in the supply chain blood and bones to make it adaptable and flexible, and often also even past shocks, like in the case of South African exporters who had had a lot of beating up by importers, for example, of their fruit, where they had to suddenly pivot to comply with new fruit disease patterns and regulations. Their strength and their muscles that were built up complying with a lot of prior shocks put them in a good position to say, okay, now this is what we need to do to pivot and be resilient in the face of the COVID shock. So the crucial prior experience in resilience, the crucial prior investment in the bloods and bones is really what allowed the systems that we observed that were most resilient to be adaptable, flexible, and resilient. Those that ran into roadblocks were literally the places that set up roadblocks to crucial lateral services like the trucking and the third-party logistics. So I hear this mantra over and over again, build back better, build back better. It does not means you should reinvent the wheel and imagine a new food system. The food system was already growing and adapting very quickly. 800% increase in the African food system, in the African food supply chain, rural to urban, in a couple decades. Southeast Asia, 1,000%. Okay, so it was already roaring ahead and where the bones and blood were in place. So building back better should be instead to say, wait, what do we do about wholesale markets, roads? Let's invest more in what already worked, in enabling environment to allow people to make the investment. And then I could give you in another talk, amazing examples of where, like in Ethiopia, where those fundamentals were in place, the small and medium enterprises, without a help from an NGO, without a help from a donor, without a help from a government, invested like mad in a massive aggregate investments that then totally changed the food supply system in 10 years. So it can work, and the grassroots revolution, the quiet revolution of the proliferation of the hidden middle, the midstream of these supply chains is ready to be unleashed and continue to make these supply chains grow, but also be more and more resilient. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tom, very much. Okay, thanks everybody. We have, I think, 8 minutes now for questions. I think we have to end at 11:45. There's all kinds of questions that could be asked. We right now have 3 in the Q&A, so I'll just go through these. If there's time, I'll ask one of my own, but we'll start with a question from Keith Fugly to Regina. Keith asked, yesterday, Usman Badian stated that the primary political assumption behind CAADP and the Aruba declarations was that heads of state would exert pressure on each other to stick to their commitments to raise investments in agriculture. Your presentation, Regina's presentation, indicates that this is much more driven by policymakers responding to domestic interest groups. What then do you see as the value of CAADP? Is this, and by this, I guess he means CAADP, is this actually a new policy paradigm for agriculture in Africa? Regina.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, what the role of these regional organizations is. I mean, it's, I think the big shift was 2002 with the reorganization and the African Union and this creation of CAADP. I think what really changed was the language. Yeah, the language from, you know, this colonialism overcoming language to a language that is much more in line with also the donor language, along with this liberalization ideas. So I think that actually did shift, but there's a long-standing literature. Yeah, so Tom Jane, for example, also looked into this false promise or false premise that analyzes that the language that is spoken in these international circles addressing donors and their priorities to get funding is different from what the actual policy is. And that is often, I mean, when we have been analyzing policy documents, that is often hidden. Yeah, because if you look at the agricultural investment plans under CAADP, then they talk about productivity improvement programs or something like that. But if you look at what they actually do, then it's subsidizing in a way where there's a conflict with what donors consider to be conducive subsidies. So in that sense, I don't think it's really a paradigm shift. It's just a continuation in a different form. But the fact that domestic policymakers need to respond to domestic political incentives, I think is something that should be acknowledged and understood. I mean, we have subsidy policies in the Western world and everywhere. So what we actually concluded from our analysis of these discourses is that it would be better to acknowledge that there are these political incentives and then see what is a more productive way to go about it. So can one really target subsidies? What would be a smarter way? How can we make sure that they really lead to productivity improvement and, you know, work jointly on it than rather, you know, having these differences on whether subsidies are good or bad.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Regina. I have a follow-up on that, but before I have a before I do that, let me ask if any of the other panelists wanted to respond to this question about CADP. Is it a new paradigm? What about the role of local stakeholders? Some of you spoke a little bit to that. Any other panelists want to respond to this at all? Okay, well, so my question then for all of you really was, you know, especially in this day and age, it seems to me that if we want to get policy change that lasts, right? If we have any chance of getting that, you know, we have to have, you know, not just local policy champions, but in order to get those local policy champions, it seems to me that we have to have local faces, credible, committed, local faces, analysts, you know, doing this analysis, packaging the information, engaging with stakeholders and so forth, you know, for some obvious cultural and even nationalistic, you know, to not use that in a negative way, reasons, right? You know, but also in terms of understanding of the ins and outs and the details of how policy might really change. So, Eric, I think that yours, so that's the importance of building capacity on the analytical front, and not just for analysis, but for understanding the policy context and how to inject it there. Eric, this was kind of implicit in your presentation, but you didn't really speak to it and how to do it and its role in getting any policy successes. Regina, yours was to some extent explicit, but at the I think it was the very last comment in your presentation, and then you spoke more to it in your response just now. So I'm just wondering if you all can speak a little bit more to, you know, maybe it's this way: how have things changed in the last decade in terms of the need for local analytical champions and policy champions, and what that means about the role of people like us in this conference right now? Thanks. Anybody who wants to respond?
Tom has his hand up, but I'm happy to go quickly first. Yeah, so I didn't get to it too much in the presentation, but that's an important part of the political will and public will frameworks. You need champions, you need people who are going to be trusted. There's a long line of thinking and research that goes back decades at this point that shows that to be persuasive, you really need credibility, and having those local champions is an important part of that. I've also advocated for, well, at least as long as I've been involved with this project, for building local capacity to do analysis, to do program evaluations, because I think that's crucial for some of these things. But what we found in Uganda and Senegal is that so local radio can be important, and you've got local people talking on the radio, people who are known in the community. The same thing with demonstration plots. The evidence is right there, but the people who are working with the demonstration plots are known in the community. And those are really influential factors for building broader support for some of these initiatives.
Thanks, Eric. Tom, and I wanted to get to Tom, if you can be brief. We can go a few minutes over, but Lourdes Martinez does have 4 questions up here, and I would like to get to at least one of them. So go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, if Sawita were here, we would talk about this a great deal, but the key thing, she says she gives her space to me. How nice, that's wonderful. Okay, I think that, you know, we talk about policy influence and all this stuff. I feel that advocating policies is not useful unless there's a basic understanding of the actual situation in the minds of the policymakers. Okay, and you can say do this, do this, do this, but if they think that the situation doesn't line up with that, it doesn't go anywhere. And a real fantastic example that we had, we did a seminar. We often do this in our research. First, we do a little policy seminar and find out what people think are the issues and the challenges and the lack of knowledge and blah, blah. And then we do the research, and then we come back with the research and say, this is what we found. And it often deeply contradicts the strongly held opinions about what is the real situation that the policymakers and the researchers, the local researchers had. And I'll give you an example. In northern Nigeria, we had a conference where the local researchers and the government of the states that we were dealing in said, there's no fish supply chain in northern Nigeria. There's nobody doing fish farming, fish wholesaling. It's all broken. All we're doing is importing fish. There's nothing here. It's a mess. And so then we went out and we did, for example, these meso surveys where we found out how many actors of different scales were being done in different segments, and found a gigantic dynamism of the fish supply chain in those states, totally contradicting what all of the local people had thought. Now, the third step is that the researchers that did that work are now going back to the government in those states, revealing that there's this unbelievable thing that was right under their nose, but they didn't have the capacity, they don't have, surveys going on, so they don't know what's going on in those things. They went back to the governments, and now the governments in those states are doing programs related to the local fish supply chains. This is a perfect example. Over and over, we see this in other countries everywhere. There's a strongly held ideas, and you have to break those ideas with the waves and waves of facts, presented by whoever. Usually it's the local people that are most effective in presenting it. But the local people were the ones that had the wrong ideas before the surveys were done. They had no idea what was going on, okay, to be honest, okay? And so waves of facts, breaking down the walls of these strongly held assumptions. And then it's just like I was saying in my talk about third-party logistics. If you think there's no truckers, that the truckers aren't important to the food supply chain, obviously you're going to declare them non-essential. You're going to harass them, as Lourdes is saying in her note. You're going to, not repair the roads and that they need to function. If instead somebody says, wait, did you know 75% of all the basic food of this country is moving by these third-party logistics firms? They would go, oh, wait, and then shift. It's basic, simple things that to me I've seen through my long and probably should be ended career, of why policies are made and how people think. They're based on several simple assumptions that you have to attack with facts, and the facts delivered locally, as Eric is saying, is brilliant. Again, I realized I could keep repeating over and over out of my enthusiasm. David's thinking, how can I exercise crowd control?
Thank you, Tom. I think we're going to move on here. We're 3 minutes over. You do remind me these waves and waves of facts, though. One of the things I said to a lot of local colleagues early on was that you're going to spend a lot of your career, and I didn't find it a depressing statement. It was just the reality. You're going to spend a lot of your career. You need to spend a lot of your career finding different ways with the different data to say basically the same thing, because the basics, the fundamentals don't change, the details and the context change. With that, I think we should move on. Carl? Thank you, everybody. Thank you for presentations, and sorry we didn't have time to get all the questions. Thanks for putting them up there, Lourdes.
Is that facts or just a facts? No. The fundamental facts don't change as time goes on.
Okay, well, on that beautiful note, we will move on to our last session, which is kind of a chance for Claire Cohen, I've had Vara Prasad from the SILS lab, SILS Innovation Lab at Kansas State, and Jim Emke, I think can be on this here. And I'll have a few wrap-up comments at the